In 1939, if you had asked any serious person who ruled the world, the answer would have been obvious. Britain. The British Empire sprawled across 13.7 million square miles, nearly a quarter of Earth's land surface. It governed 458 million people, roughly a fifth of humanity. The sun literally never set on British territory. The pound sterling was the currency that mattered. The Royal Navy was unmatched. London was the financial center of the universe. 17 years later, in 1956, Britain was reduced to begging the United States for permission to defend its own strategic interests. The humiliation was so complete that the Prime Minister resigned in disgrace. By 1967, the pound, once as solid as the gold that backed it, had collapsed. By 1976, Britain stood in line at the International Monetary Fund, hat in hand, accepting a bailout with conditions that would have been unthinkable for a great power just a generation earlier. The transformation was breathtaking in its speed and totality. In a single human lifetime, Britain went from the world's dominant superpower to a secondary European power dependent on American goodwill and IMF supervision. The empire that had shaped the modern world for 2 centuries was finished. The textbooks offer a sanitized version of this story. They tell us Britain gracefully granted independence to its colonies as moral consciousness evolved. They speak of inevitable historical forces, the rise of nationalism, and the end of the colonial era, as though these were natural phenomena beyond anyone's control. It's a comforting narrative that allows everyone to feel good about how history unfolded. But it's a lie. Or at least, it's only a small fraction of the truth. Britain didn't choose to end its empire. Britain went bankrupt. The money ran out. The bills came due. And when a nation can no longer pay its debts, it loses the ability to choose its own destiny. This is the story of how Britain spent itself into irrelevance, and why understanding this matters desperately for Americans today. Because the pattern that destroyed British power in 30 years is now playing out in the United States, except faster, with higher stakes, and with far less awareness of what's coming. To understand Britain's collapse, you first need to understand just how dominant it was in 1920, at the peak of its imperial power. Territory is impressive, but territory wasn't Britain's real strength. Financial dominance was. The pound sterling wasn't just Britain's currency, it was the currency. International trade was conducted in pounds. Countries held their national reserves in pounds. If you wanted to buy coffee from Brazil, or rubber from Malaysia, or oil from Persia, you needed British pounds to do it. This created an inexhaustible demand for British currency, which gave Britain extraordinary economic leverage. The City of London was the Wall Street of its day, except with no serious competitors. British banks financed railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in India, factories in Australia. British investors owned productive assets on every continent. Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. Other countries owed Britain money, not the other way around. This financial supremacy allowed Britain to borrow money at the absolute lowest interest rates in the world. Why? Because lending to Britain was considered the safest investment on earth. This cheap credit allowed Britain to fund an enormous military and a vast colonial administration through debt rather than taxation. It was a self-reinforcing system. Financial power enabled military power, which protected financial power, which generated more wealth, which funded more military power. The foundation of this entire system was the gold standard. The pound wasn't just paper backed by promises. It was backed by actual physical gold at a fixed rate of $4.86 per ounce. You could walk into a bank with paper pounds and walk out with gold. This wasn't symbolic. It made the currency tangibly valuable and universally trusted. Britain's economy wasn't the world's largest. The United States had already surpassed it in absolute economic output by 1920. But for an island nation of only 44 million people to be the world's second largest economy was extraordinary. British coal powered the world's factories. British steel built the world's infrastructure. British textiles clothed millions. British machinery and engineering expertise were exported everywhere. And protecting all of this was the Royal Navy, still the largest and most powerful naval force on the planet, capable of projecting power anywhere on Earth. On the surface, in 1920, Britain looked invincible. But underneath, the foundation was already beginning to crumble. The Great War didn't just kill a generation of young British men. It killed Britain's financial dominance. From 1914 to 1918, the war cost Britain approximately $35 billion. To a modern reader, that might not sound catastrophic, but context is everything. Britain's entire GDP in 1914 was about $2.5 billion. The war cost 14 times the nation's annual economic output. Imagine if the United States, with a GDP of roughly $27 trillion today, spent $378 trillion on a single conflict. That's the scale of financial devastation we're talking about. Where did this impossible sum come from? First, taxation. Britain raised taxes to levels that would have been unthinkable before the war. Income tax, which had barely touched most citizens before 1914, shot up to 30% for many. But even these punishing tax rates couldn't possibly cover the costs of industrial-scale warfare. Second, borrowing. Britain sold war bonds to its own citizens, turning the population into creditors of the state. But domestic borrowing wasn't nearly enough. Britain also borrowed massive sums from the United States. For the first time in centuries, Britain became a net debtor. The nation that had been the world's banker was now in debt to a former colony. Third, asset sales. To pay for weapons, ammunition, ships, and supplies, Britain liquidated foreign investments it had spent decades accumulating. Assets that generated income were sold off for one-time cash. It was like selling your house to pay your credit card bill. It solves an immediate crisis while destroying long-term wealth. By 1918, Britain's national debt had exploded from $650 million to over $7.4 billion, an 11-fold increase in just 4 years. This was unprecedented peacetime debt that would haunt Britain for decades. Then there was the currency disaster. In 1914, Britain abandoned the gold standard so it could print money to fund the war. For the first time in centuries, the pound was no longer backed by gold. It was just paper backed by government promises. This allowed Britain to finance the war, but it destroyed the pound's credibility as the world's reserve currency. In 1925, Winston Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, made what economists now consider one of the worst policy decisions in British history, returning to the gold standard at the old pre-war exchange rate. The problem was that the pound was now massively overvalued compared to its real economic worth. This made British exports expensive and uncompetitive in global markets. British factories couldn't sell their goods abroad. Unemployment soared. The economy stagnated throughout the 1920s. The damage was done, but it wasn't obvious to everyone. Britain still had its empire. The map was still painted red. The pound still looked like the pound. But underneath, the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. The United States had gone from debtor to creditor. Britain had gone from creditor to debtor. The financial foundation of British power, the ability to borrow cheaply and lend profitably, was broken. Britain was now hanging on by reputation alone. If World War I was expensive, World War II was financially apocalyptic. The Second World War cost Britain another $28 billion. But again, the absolute number is meaningless without context. Britain's economy was already weakened from World War I and the Great Depression. This new burden was impossible. Britain fought World War II through total economic mobilization. At the war's peak, an astonishing 55% of Britain's entire GDP was dedicated to military spending. More than half of everything the nation produced went toward the war effort. Food was rationed, fuel was rationed, clothing was rationed. Every resource, every factory, every worker was directed toward a single goal: survival. This was completely unsustainable. You cannot indefinitely dedicate more than half your economy to war production without collapsing. Britain was burning through what remained of its wealth at a catastrophic rate. By 1941, Britain was on the verge of total collapse. It could no longer pay for the weapons, food, and fuel it needed to continue fighting. That's when the United States stepped in with Lend-Lease. The program was presented as an act of Allied solidarity. President Roosevelt famously said, "You don't charge your neighbor for the hose when his house is on fire." But the reality was far more calculating. Lend-Lease was not charity. It was a business transaction that transferred global power from Britain to America. The terms were carefully designed to benefit the United States. Britain would receive weapons, supplies, and food, which it would pay back after the war, with interest. In exchange, Britain had to agree to dismantle the imperial trade preferences that had protected British economic interests for decades. The empire had to be open to American trade and investment. Britain had to accept American financial oversight. In essence, the United States bought Britain's empire at a massive discount. Britain was trading its global dominance for survival. By 1945, Britain's national debt reached 250% of GDP. The debt was 2.5 times larger than the entire British economy. To put this in perspective, U.S. debt today is around 123% of GDP. Greece, at the absolute worst of its debt crisis, peaked at 180%. Britain in 1945 was in a category beyond crisis. To service this debt, Britain had to liquidate everything of value that could be sold. Foreign investments accumulated over centuries were sold off. Gold reserves were depleted. Overseas properties, art collections, anything that could be converted to cash was sacrificed. In just 30 years, Britain had completed an almost unimaginable transformation from the world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation. Britain was now completely dependent on the United States for survival, dependent on American loans to feed its population, dependent on American approval for its foreign policy, dependent on American goodwill for its economic stability. In July 1944, while war still raged in Europe and the Pacific, representatives from 44 nations gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war financial system. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most brilliant economist of the 20th century. Keynes proposed creating a new neutral international currency called the Bancor that would be used for international trade, preventing any single nation from having the reserve currency advantage. The United States sent Harry Dexter White, a senior Treasury official. White had a different vision. The U.S. dollar would become the new global reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. Britain, bankrupted by 2 world wars and completely dependent on American credit, was in no position to argue. The United States held all the cards. Britain needed American loans more than America needed British cooperation. The dollar replaced the pound. This wasn't just a technical monetary adjustment. It was the single most important transfer of power in the 20th century. When you control the reserve currency, you control the global economy. It means everyone needs your money to conduct international trade. It creates inexhaustible global demand for your currency. It means you can run massive trade deficits indefinitely because the world needs your dollars to function. You can borrow at the lowest interest rates because everyone wants to hold your currency. Your financial sector dominates global banking and investment. For 200 years, Britain had enjoyed these extraordinary privileges. In 1944, they were handed to the United States. Britain's empire didn't end because of moral awakening or inevitable historical forces. It ended because Britain could no longer afford to be an empire, and the financial system that had sustained British power now sustained American power instead. Britain tried desperately to maintain the illusion of great power status after the war, but the economic fundamentals were broken beyond repair. The pound was massively overvalued, but admitting this was admitting Britain was no longer a great power. Britain ran persistent trade deficits, importing more than it exported. Without the reserve currency advantage, this was unsustainable. The nation was consuming more than it produced, spending more than it earned, and living on borrowed time. The first public humiliation came in 1949. Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30%, from $4.03 to $2.80. Great powers don't devalue their currencies. Devaluation is an admission of weakness, an acknowledgement that your economy isn't as strong as you claimed. But the deeper problem wasn't the exchange rate. The problem was that Britain could no longer afford its empire. Think about the costs. Maintaining a global empire meant military garrisons across dozens of countries, a naval presence in every ocean, vast colonial administrations employing hundreds of thousands of British officials, infrastructure investments in territories that generated little return, constant military operations against independence movements. Britain's economy was half the size of America's, yet it was trying to maintain a global footprint that even the United States would have struggled to afford. The math simply didn't work. The moment the world saw that Britain was finished came in 1956. Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway for shipping, especially oil from the Middle East to Europe. Britain, which owned 44% of the Suez Canal Company, viewed this as an unacceptable threat to its interests and international law. Britain, along with France and Israel, launched a military operation to retake the canal. Militarily, it was a complete success. Within days, British and French forces occupied the canal zone. The operation went exactly as planned. Then the United States intervened. President Eisenhower was furious. He opposed the operation and decided to teach Britain a lesson about who actually ran the world now. America didn't need to use bombs. It used finance. The United States threatened economic sanctions. It threatened to cut off oil supplies to Britain. Most critically, it threatened to sell its massive holdings of British pounds on the open market, which would have crashed the currency. America also blocked Britain's access to emergency loans from the International Monetary Fund. It was financial blackmail, pure and simple. Britain's foreign exchange reserves were draining away by the hour. The pound was collapsing. The U.S. delivered a clear ultimatum: withdraw from Suez immediately or face complete financial ruin. Britain had no choice. Despite achieving total military victory, it withdrew in humiliation. The Suez Crisis revealed the New World Order with brutal clarity. British military power meant absolutely nothing without American financial approval. The empire was a facade. The United States was pulling the strings. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace. Across the empire, independence movements saw that Britain was weak and accelerated their campaigns. Suez didn't cause the end of the empire, but it made the end undeniable and irreversible. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Britain earned a new title: the sick man of Europe. The country was plagued by stagflation, the toxic combination of high inflation and economic stagnation. Strikes paralyzed industry. The energy crisis made everything worse. Manufacturing collapsed. Brain drain saw Britain's best minds emigrate to America. The nation that had been the wealthiest on Earth 50 years earlier was now in managed decline. In 1967, Britain devalued the pound again, another 14% cut. Prime Minister Harold Wilson went on television and famously told the British people that the pound in your pocket hadn't been devalued. It was a transparent lie, and everyone knew it. Why did devaluations keep happening? Britain was trapped in a vicious cycle. It consumed more than it produced, running persistent trade deficits. Without reserve currency status, it had to pay for imports with foreign currency, and it kept running out. The Bank of England would try to defend the pound by selling reserves and raising interest rates. But it was fighting a losing battle. Each devaluation bought a few years of breathing room before the next crisis. The ultimate humiliation came in 1976. Facing yet another currency collapse, Britain had to go to the International Monetary Fund, an organization it had helped create, and beg for a bailout. The IMF agreed, but attached harsh conditions: cut government spending, raise interest rates, implement austerity. The nation that once ruled a quarter of the world was now taking orders from international bureaucrats. Britain's collapse followed a clear, identifiable pattern. First, massive debt accumulation from wars. Britain fought 2 world wars it couldn't afford, turning itself from creditor to debtor. Second, loss of reserve currency status. The pound was replaced by the dollar at Bretton Woods, stripping Britain of its greatest economic advantage. Third, persistent deficits from consuming more than you produce. Britain ran trade deficits year after year, living beyond its means. Fourth, repeated currency devaluations. The pound was devalued in 1949 and 1967, each time destroying wealth and confidence. Fifth, dependence on foreign creditors. Britain became dependent on American and IMF loans just to keep functioning. Sixth, loss of political independence. By 1976, Britain was taking policy orders from the IMF. It could no longer make sovereign decisions about its own economy. Seventh, forced liquidation of assets. The empire was dismantled not because of moral enlightenment, but because Britain couldn't afford to maintain it. This pattern didn't happen randomly. It was the inevitable consequence of spending beyond your means for too long. Now look at the United States today and ask yourself, does any of this sound familiar? Debt accumulation. The U.S. national debt exceeds $35 trillion and is growing by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. We fought 20 years of wars in the Middle East that cost trillions and achieved little. We've run massive deficits in good economic times and bad. Decline in reserve currency status. It's happening slowly, but it's happening. China and Russia are conducting trade in yuan and rubles. BRICS nations are discussing alternatives to dollar-based trade. Central banks are reducing their dollar holdings. The percentage of global reserves held in dollars has declined from 73% in 2001 to around 58% today. Persistent trade deficits. The United States has run a trade deficit every single year since 1976. We consume far more than we produce, importing goods paid for with dollars that other countries are increasingly less eager to hold. Currency pressure. The dollar has lost over 86% of its purchasing power since 1971, when Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility. Inflation is destroying the savings of ordinary Americans. Rising debt costs. Interest payments on the national debt now exceed $1 trillion annually, more than the entire defense budget. As interest rates rise, this number will grow exponentially. Growing constraints on action. America's foreign policy is increasingly constrained by financial considerations. We can't afford another major war. We're dependent on foreign creditors, particularly China, to buy our debt. The final stage for Britain was empire liquidation. The terrifying question for America is, what do we liquidate when the bill comes due. Britain's collapse took about 30 years, from the end of World War II in 1945 to the IMF bailout in 1976. But Britain's collapse happened in a slower, less interconnected world. Information traveled by telegraph and telephone. Financial markets operated during business hours. Capital controls limited how quickly money could move between countries. Today's world is radically different. Information moves at the speed of light. Financial markets operate 24/7 globally. Trillions of dollars can be moved between countries with a keystroke. A currency crisis can spiral out of control in hours, not months. What took Britain 3 decades could take America half that time, perhaps less. The signs are already visible for those willing to see them. The dollar's share of global reserves is declining. America's creditors are increasingly reluctant to finance our deficits. Inflation is returning. Debt costs are exploding. Political dysfunction makes meaningful reform nearly impossible. Britain's empire didn't end because of moral progress or the inevitable arc of history bending toward justice. Those are comforting stories we tell ourselves. Britain's empire ended because Britain went broke. The money ran out. The debt became unsustainable. Foreign creditors lost confidence. The currency collapsed. And when a nation can no longer pay its bills, it loses the power to determine its own fate. Financial power is the only real power. Military strength is meaningless if you can't afford to sustain it. You can have the world's most advanced military, but if you can't pay your soldiers, or fuel your ships, or maintain your equipment, that military becomes irrelevant. Reserve currency status is the ultimate superpower. It allows you to run deficits that would bankrupt any other nation. It gives you leverage over the global economy. Losing it is catastrophic. Britain learned these lessons the hard way, and the learning process destroyed its empire and reduced it to a secondary power dependent on American approval. The United States is now following the exact same trajectory Britain followed, except faster and with much higher stakes. The question is not whether America will face consequences for its fiscal recklessness. The question is when, and whether Americans will recognize what's happening before it's too late to change course. Britain had a Suez moment in 1956, a crystallizing event that revealed to the world that British power was finished. The whole world watched as America financially crushed Britain for daring to act independently. America's Suez moment is coming. It might be a debt crisis, where foreign creditors refuse to buy treasury bonds. It might be a dollar crisis, where countries abandon the dollar en masse. It might be a geopolitical event, where America backs down because it can't afford the financial consequences of acting. But it's coming. The only question is whether Americans will learn from Britain's mistakes before history repeats itself, or whether we'll insist on learning the same painful lessons ourselves. The empire that couldn't afford itself is now history. The question is whether America will become the next chapter in that history, or whether we'll write a different ending. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes with devastating precision. Britain ignored the warning signs for decades. The debt kept growing. The deficits kept mounting. The currency kept weakening. And then, suddenly, it was too late. The empire was gone, liquidated to pay debts that should never have been allowed to accumulate. America is further down this road than most people realize. The $35 trillion debt isn't just a number, it's a ticking time bomb. Every day we add another $3 billion to that total. Every year, more of our tax revenue goes toward interest payments instead of building our future. The question that matters most: how long do we have before America faces its own Suez moment? Is it 5 years? 10? 20? Or could it happen tomorrow if the wrong crisis hits at the wrong time? I want to hear from you. How long do you think America has before foreign creditors lose confidence in our ability to repay our debts? What do you think America's Suez moment will look like? Will it be a debt crisis? A currency collapse? A geopolitical humiliation where we're forced to back down because we can't afford the consequences? What would America have to liquidate to pay our debts? Our gold reserves? Our military presence overseas? Strategic assets? Land? Can America change course? Or is this collapse inevitable? What would it take to actually fix this problem before it destroys us? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The people who understand what's coming are the ones who'll be prepared when it arrives. And if this changed how you see America's trajectory, if you realize we're not having an abstract debate about policy, but watching the same pattern that destroyed British power now playing out in real time, hit that subscribe button. This channel cuts through the economic propaganda and shows you the financial forces that actually shape history. No fluff, no political cheerleading, just the hard truth about where money and power really flow. Subscribe now, because the next video will show you exactly what happens to ordinary people when empires go bankrupt, and how you can protect yourself and your family when America's bill finally comes due. The empire that couldn't afford itself is now a history lesson. Whether America becomes the next chapter in that story is still being written.